Thank you, Charles. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. So, as was just said, my name is Michael Marcusa. I'm a consultant for Minas Associates, and I'm also a doctoral student in political science at Brown University in the United States. I've been based in Tunisia since June of 2015 and also spent significant time in Tunisia during 2013 and 2014 as well. I've witnessed the evolution of Tunisia's street politics over several years and have seen firsthand how the rise of jihadist ideology among a segment of the population has been interwoven with these changes. My observations today are based on close on-the-ground interactions with revolutionaries, radical leftists, jihadist sympathizers, close friends of those who've joined militant groups in Syria, youth contemplating illegal immigration to Europe, and countless unemployed men waging their own private battles over identity, who have watched the rise of radicalism as not-so-detached observers. So today I'm going to try to shed light on why jihadist ideas resonate among certain populations and offer some insights on where the threat may be going, based on my on-the-ground research in Tunisia. In doing so, I hope to get beyond the familiar cliche we often see in news reports and in even policy analysis papers that says that jihadism is simply a manifestation of unemployment and poverty. I think economic marginalization is an important part of the story, but a purely economic interpretation of the phenomenon fails to explain, for instance, why Libya, which was the richest country in the Maghreb region, saw jihadism gain widespread street legitimacy after the revolution, or why Morocco, which has historically been poorer than Tunisia or Algeria, has not seen much support for the phenomenon. I contend that if you want to understand the threat and where it may be going, purely looking at economic indicators is a poor approach. Moving beyond this mechanical understanding of jihadism, however, requires a deep knowledge of the mechanisms through which jihadists recruit in communities. And this is something which I'm hoping to contribute with my research. Although my own work is focused on one country, the real value of the project is, as I see it, developing a conceptual lens that helps us look at jihadism transnationally. So today, while I'm going to spend the bulk of the time talking about my work in Tunisia, at the end I hope to offer some analytical points about the future of jihadism in North Africa more generally. So let's just get right into it. How did jihadism in Tunisia start? In the wake of the Bardo attacks and the Sousse attacks, it became clear to many in the West that despite real progress that Tunisia has made since 2011, one of the more sinister dynamics of the transition has been the spread of jihadist ideology among a segment of the population. In addition to the violent incidents we've seen inside Tunisia itself, there's compelling evidence that Tunisians formed the largest contingent of young fighters and jihadist groups in Syria and Libya. Despite this, very few people have a sense of where jihadism in Tunisia originated as a social phenomenon. So I'd like to begin my analysis by discussing some of the history that my research has uncovered. In the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks in certain areas of Tunisia, Osama bin Laden emerged as a very popular figure among some segments of the population. Because of the corresponding emergence of conspiracy thinking after 9/11, however, many people supported bin Laden as an enemy of the US government while still denying his culpability for the September 11th attacks. By the mid-2000s, however, a small handful of these al-Qaeda sympathizers had organized militant cells in secret. Most of these cells were very easily broken up by Tunisian authorities. And as a result of these security efforts, hundreds of alleged jihadists were in prison at the time of the revolution in Tunisia. As part of the general amnesty in 2011, however, many of these jihadists were released and quickly started building a grassroots movement. From 2011 until August of 2013, these jihadists were allowed to operate openly and started a movement that became known colloquially as jihadist Salafism, or simply Salafism. The Tunisian Salafists were almost uniformly jihadist in their orientation, and they organized during this period preaching tents, effectively took over mosques across the country, and even made appearances on national television. The movement claimed to be nonviolent, and to be fair, it did not adopt violence during this period. It was only after 2013 that there were substantial militant incidents inside Tunisia itself. At the time, however, even when it was operating openly, this movement recruited many young men in Tunisia to go to Syria to fight for jihadist groups there. So now the movement is no longer allowed to operate openly, and many jihadist Salafists have been arrested. Since the movement has been outlawed, attacks have increased against security forces in Tunisia, but they've also lost a significant amount of support on the street. And it seems to be very much a fringe ideology, even in poor marginalized areas where it was once mainstream in the immediate period after the revolution. So we'll talk about the implications of this a little bit later. So who are the jihadists? Most are young. Even the senior leaders are rarely over 40 years old. Most became jihadists after the revolution. Some came from habitually religious backgrounds. They had no strong desire for the imposition of Sharia law, but they prayed and fasted and had a strong connection with their Islamic identity. Many, however, were not religious at all. I've often heard that the most consistent social group to enter jihadist Salafist current as raging ideologues were the youth who were particularly into alcohol, drugs, and going out with girls. There's some evidence that the Salafists specifically targeted these people. I heard a story, maybe apocryphal, about drunk kids walking past a jihadist Salafist preaching tent in one of these interior towns, and the Salafists called out to them, "The gates of repentance are open." So even some self-styled jihadist Salafist imams were once part of this hard-drinking, hard-partying contingent. What's interesting, though, is that beyond the hardcore street activists, there were a large number of people who didn't accept the Salafist moniker, but said Salafists were right in matters of both religion and politics. They never started praying, continued to drink alcohol, and were hardly practicing Muslims, but said that they were simply being disobedient in their religion, and the Salafists had the right interpretation. They always insisted that despite their personal religious shortcomings, Sharia was necessary. As far as Tunisians going to Syria, they came from both groups. And because this group of irreligious jihadist Salafist sympathizers is much bigger, I think it's potentially more important. A 2013 survey revealed that 11% of Tunisians really trusted the Salafists a lot, and 23% trusted them somewhat. So here we have 34% of Tunisians at the height of the movement's popularity, expressing at least some degree of sympathy for this movement. A follow-up survey, by the way, showed that it's far less, I think 11% in the two groups combined. Now the question is, why did they join? I want to start by offering the observation that jihadist Salafism is a religio-political ideology, which means there's both a religious component and a political component. In Tunisia, the political component of the ideology contains essentially 4 different planks. The Tunisian state as it has existed since independence should be destroyed. All of the states as they currently exist in the Muslim world should be destroyed. The West, and especially the United States, should be confronted. And finally, a totalizing conception of Islamic Sharia law should form the basis of the new political system after all this destruction is accomplished. So the religious component contains 2 planks, and we need to really focus on the distinction between what's political and what's religious. The Islamic scriptures ought to be interpreted ultra-literally without regard to context. And second of all, fighting the regimes in the West and imposing Sharia is not simply something which should be done, that's the political side, but in fact it's a religious duty, and anybody who does not support jihadism is not a proper Muslim. So this is a minority interpretation of Islam, especially in Tunisia. But at least rhetorically, jihadists did try to justify their ideology on the basis of religious arguments. I bring up the idea that it's both a political and a religious ideology because it highlights the fact that there are many different pathways into the ideology. What often happens is that people become attracted to the jihadist ideology because they become convinced of one of these political ideological pillars, and then simply accept the rest, including the religious part, automatically. This is similar to how someone who is strongly opposed to legalized abortion in the United States might vote for the American Republican Party, and then also outwardly display loyalty to its economic message, even though the economic side of the ideology was not the immediate motivator. So in my own research, I've been convinced that in Tunisia, jihadist Salafism resonates among those who have 3 mindsets. The first is a sense of extreme alienation from the state. This derives first from a sense of not meeting one's potential, and second of all, that the state is to blame for this gap between aspirations and reality. So let's get a little bit more into this belief and what it means. The feeling of not meeting one's full potential is widely held among Tunisia's youth, and this, I argue, is the result of several important dynamics. The first is most obvious: mass unemployment and economic stagnation, particularly in the country's interior. Without a job, and particularly without a government job, you can't get a loan to buy a house and you can't get married and have kids. And because Tunisia is a conservative society, marriage is very central to relationships. So economic stagnation isn't just something that prevents people from getting stuff, it prevents them from getting a lot of the personal pleasures of relationships and family life. The second dimension is, ironically, the success of the Tunisian state under Bourguiba, who was the post-independence president in trying to impose a vision of modernity among the population, which was drawing inspiration from the West and trying to emulate Western societies in their practices and culture and in, at least superficially, some of their institutions. So through educational curricula built around the French model, state-controlled television program that privileged certain modes of dress and social habits over others, and historical efforts to marginalize the role of religion in society, a lot of people in Tunisia viewed the perceived material progress of the West as the perceived metric for personal success. So the promise of bourguibism is that if you work hard, you too can have a nice house and a nice car and live like they do in Europe. And that's a promise that for many has, until now, gone unfulfilled, leading to dissatisfaction. Now, third, because of globalization, today's youth are even more attuned to what life is like in the West than they were before. Through Hollywood movies, social media, and the internet, they have a picture, perhaps it's a fantasy, but they have a picture of how people live in the West, and they feel it's much better than how they live. And this leads to this feeling that they're not getting what they deserve, and they see this difference, and they feel unsatisfied. So people blame the state for these problems because as the economic conditions persist, most people's interaction with the state is very negative. There's a perception that there's an alliance between Western politicians, business interests, and the leaders of their own political parties, and this often includes conspiratorial thinking about the Freemasons or New World Order. I'm not endorsing the perception, but I'm merely describing it because we have to understand it. And so I think the perception is fueled by several dynamics. First, most people's interaction with their own government is filled with corruption and inefficiency. People told me that before the revolution there were simply a few corrupt families who got preferential treatment, but now everyone can influence things with just a small amount of money, and there's corruption in everything from registration in public universities to public employment. So now we have the democratization of corruption. Even you can corrupt now. People feel like the revolution hasn't changed anything. Unemployment has increased. The tourist sector has collapsed. Trash has amassed in public areas. Political parties have almost zero legitimacy on the street, and politicians are frequently perceived as simply engaging in rent-seeking and plundering the public treasury. This is so even though one of the parties has a moderate Islamist ideology. And then finally, people still have a very negative view of the police. Use of torture is still widespread. Police use intimidation to try to shake people down for bribes. And there's a perception that nothing has changed there. So we see that economic marginalization is a really important part of the story. But in order for people to develop this confrontational view towards the state, which jihadist Salafism preys upon, they need to connect their personal suffering with the political order. And I argue that that has happened very effectively in Tunisia. So the thing is that while alienation from the state might be important in priming people for the jihadist recruitment efforts, it is not sufficient to attract them to the cause. Feeling alienated from the state and believing that one should personally play a role in confronting the state are two different things, and we need to analyze them as separate categories. While the majority of Tunisian youth feel this sense of alienation, most have a fatalistic view about the situation in Tunisia. They feel demoralized and pessimistic, but they immerse themselves in football or their friend groups, or look into illegal immigration to Europe, or try to start relationships with foreign girls on Facebook so they can marry and leave Tunisia. There are certain areas of Tunisia, however, that have long resisted centralization, and these are the areas that have seen jihadist Salafism get the most popular support. And these are the areas I work on. When one looks quantitatively at where jihadist Salafists are coming from in Tunisia, from the limited data we have, we see a striking correspondence between the tribal areas that played the most significant role in the resistance to the French invasion of Tunisia in the 19th century, the regions where the armed uprising against the French colonialists was concentrated during the 1950s, and the areas that rose up quickly and aggressively during the 2011 revolution, and the areas where jihadist Salafists have made the significant inroads. So there's these historically restive areas which jihadist Salafists have found a lot of support in. And what characterizes these areas beyond their history of confrontation with the central state is the cultural legacy of nomadic pastoralism, which means grazing animals as opposed to doing settled agriculture. So the current youth generation is only a few generations removed from this Bedouin experience of tents and seasonal migration. And so I argue that this legacy of past battles with the government has given youth in these areas a particular social worldview that makes a lot of the symbols that jihadists use intuitive. So Sidi Bouzid, the primary city that I study, is one of these perennial hot areas, and it's very strongly reflected in the culture. Like many Bedouin communities, it's an area that has an extreme honor culture, where people have a strong aversion to feelings of insult or humiliation. A refrain I often hear is, "We can tolerate hunger, but we cannot tolerate oppression." This is from some of the revolutionaries. People have a vision of politics that pits real men against collaborators, or snitches is the term they use. So they take pride in the role their grandparents played in the armed uprising against the French, but feel that the modern Tunisian state has betrayed this legacy and marginalized them economically. In these areas, in addition to having these traditions, seem to connect this resistance in attacking the state to this vision of masculinity. The glory of resistance against authority and the idea that attacking the state is honorable is seen as the epitome of manhood and was used as a rallying cry during the initial protests of the revolution. It was also used in the political speech and recruitment efforts of jihadist Salafists. And tragically, a lot of the same youth who were leading protests during the revolution became jihadist Salafists, and a significant number of them went to Syria. So why is it that Salafism appeals to people who have this confrontational view of the state? There's a few factors. First of all, the ideology promises a clean break with established tradition and describes the state and its agents in totalizing terms as tyrants. This resonates with people who have a political identity centered around confrontation with the state. It makes critiques of the state which people already agree with. It says the state is corrupt, lying, and immoral because it's not ruling with the religion. And for people who feel this historical sense of injustice and alienation, the religious element is only a small jump, particularly because all of them at least have a nominal affinity to their Islamic identity. And then finally, and this is going to be very important for the comparative angle, Salafism in political Islam is historically the most subversive possible political ideology in Tunisia, given this high modernist ideology which the state tried to impose after independence. Anybody who's trying to completely repudiate the vision of society that the Tunisian state represents can go to jihadist Salafism. It's the most radical solution and was historically the most taboo ideology one could hold, at least as far as the state was concerned. So from these historically restive areas, Salafism emerged as a as a protest language which fits with their belief that resistance against the state is an inherently honorable path. There's a catch, however. In order for jihadism to continue to attract such widespread support, it needs to credibly maintain its claim to be a utopian ideology. In addition to channeling people's frustration with the state and serving as an outlet for this historical memory of resistance, people need to believe that jihadism's claims to be restoring the Golden Age are legitimate. When jihadists make outlandish claims like they're going to raise the flag of Islam over the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, or are going to break all the borders, or raise the flag of Islam over the White House, people need to at least have the emotional belief that this can be accomplished. So in the period immediately following the Arab Spring, several dynamics contributed to the jihadist ability to maintain this feeling of a utopian energy. First, in the Arab world, there was a general belief that sudden, unpredictable change could be accomplished. In Tunisia, the idea that Ben Ali could disappear had seemed like an impossibility. So the political imagination was primed to accept other seemingly impossible things could happen. Second, jihadists gained a lot of street legitimacy in the Arab world for the role they played in the Al-Anbar insurgency against the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. The Iraqi insurgents were widely supported by Tunisians, and because radical Islamists made up the fiercest and most successful condition of the insurgents, many came to sympathize. Third, jihadist brigades had emerged as the most effective fighting force against the Syrian regime during the early days of the civil war, and the strength of their gains astounded people. When IS effectively erased the border between Iraq and Syria, this made it seem like the group's reach was limitless. Its utopian message had real credibility. So, just to summarize, I should have skipped forward to that. You can think of there being this social cocktail, and it has these three dynamics which I've discussed. So, first is an extreme alienation from the state. Just to reiterate, this means that the success of jihadist recruitment does not depend on the pre-existing religiosity of a group. While it's a religio-political ideology, the political rather than the religious content is driving its resonance. So rather than focusing on Islamism as an ideology, the better approach is to ask, what political impulse is that ideology serving as an expression of? And then try to assess how that political impulse might change over time, as well as the continued symbolic connection between jihadist ideology and this political impulse. So it's a more complex form of analysis we need to do. Second of all, it's this cultural belief system that makes the symbolism that jihadists use familiar. We've talked a lot about the role of collective memory of past struggles with the state in shaping the political consciousness of communities that jihadists seek to penetrate. So just to reiterate, the idea that one's personal sense of honor and freedom from insult is sacred, and the idea that the use of violence to defend that honor is glorified, is an idea that jihadists often play on. And finally, and this is going to be very important, the jihadists need to be operating in an environment where people really can trust that the Sharia can be a panacea and they can actually possibly accomplish what they say they're going to accomplish. And this has a lot to do with the particular historical moment. So my argument is that when the Syria conflict was beginning in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring, it was a moment where ideologies like this could find particular utopian credibility. But I will argue that this utopian luster has not been sustained. Something fundamentally has changed in the way marginalized youth are understanding and perceiving jihadism today, and that's something I'm going to cover when we talk about future prospects of the threat. Finally, one other point. We talked a little bit about jihadist Salafism in these tribal peripheries. And I want to pause and see what this analysis, which I've gotten from my work in Tunisia, can tell us about the rest of the Arab Spring, because this issue of tribal peripheries and economic malaise is widespread in the Middle East and North Africa. And having seen how these regions in Tunisia with the most jihadist influence have this legacy of pastoral nomadism and resistance to centralized authority, I began to look at other areas of the Arab world, and I noticed a trend. The regions where jihadists seem to gain the most street-level legitimacy have the same legacy of nomadic pastoralism and resistance to centralization. So I want to just run through some of the other cases quickly. In Syria, the region where IS took hold most forcefully was not Idlib or Aleppo, regions that had rebelled forcefully against the Syrian regime, but had long established agriculture and deep integration with urban culture in the Middle East. Rather, it was areas on Syria's eastern tribal periphery that have this nomadic legacy too. Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, pretty much all of the towns east of Aleppo once the landscape turns arid. So for those of us who were following it at the time, one of the most important steps IS took back in 2013 or 2014 when they were coming into more full control over these areas was getting the loyalty or the bay'ah of local tribal leaders in that area. And so I think that the argument applies quite well to the Syria case. In Jordan, the historically most politically restive city is a place called Man in the far south of the country. And this is also a city where the population is descended from Bedouin horsemen who resisted the Ottomans' efforts to subdue the city in the 19th century. Since 2011, it has been a major contributor of foreign fighters to the Syria conflict and a center of jihadist Salafist ideology. Zarqa, another town on Jordan's tribal periphery and the birthplace of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, has a similar history. In Egypt, despite the heavy-handed tactics of el-Sisi and continuing economic malaise, the region has witnessed an active insurgency, and Egypt's armed jihadist groups are operating is the Sinai Peninsula, the region that has seen this, an area populated almost exclusively by the descendants of nomadic Bedouins. And in the 1980s and 1990s, it was the historically nomadic Sa'id region in Egypt's south that was a bastion of support for the jihadist Jama'ah Islamiyah, not the more historically centralized Delta region. And finally, in Libya, the growth of jihadism may seem perplexing. Of the Maghreb countries, Libya was by far the most wealthy in terms of per capita GDP and had a relatively high standard of living despite the brutal authoritarianism of Gaddafi. So it's a case that defies a lot of the most conventional explanations for jihadism as being reduced to simple economic interest. What distinguishes Libya from its neighbors, however, is that it is a completely tribal society. There was no actual state of Libya before Italian colonialism. It represents the union of three very loosely linked Ottoman provinces that had little control over their hinterlands. In contrast to Tunisia, where the regime basically tried to marginalize tribal identity, Gaddafi's regime encouraged tribalism and tried to cultivate an illusion of statelessness. And so when I look at the Libya case and why jihadists have gained such a foothold there, I again come back to the connection between jihadist ideology, nomadic legacies, and historical memory. It's worth noting that the region where jihadism first took hold in Libya was the eastern part of the country, which was where the resistance to the Italian occupation of Libya was concentrated. Now the threat has taken a different direction. That's something we're going to discuss later. So before getting to the rest of the comparison, let's go back to Tunisia and try to talk about future prospects. Where is the threat going? So having talked about the ingredients which jihadism requires, these three dynamics which I harped on, it is true on the one hand that the economic malaise and feelings of disconnectedness with the state, and of course the inescapable centuries of tribal history, have not changed. On the other hand, I've noticed something very important in my field research over the past few years, and particularly over the past year. The death of the fantasy and the positive imaginations people have about Salafism or jihadism or radical Islamism. In the first couple of years after the revolution, many people who were not at all religious would express sympathy with the Salafists or express hope in the solution that could come from Sharia. Others would express their faith in some kind of millenarian view of world events, believing that the world was about to change dramatically in unpredictable ways. Now what I've seen among these same people is a resigned acceptance and a return to the monotony of daily life. One friend of mine from Sidi Bouzid, the city where the revolution began, said to me back in 2013, "We used to talk sports, now we talk politics." So returning to the same group of friends in 2015, the conversation has now turned exclusively back to sports. And this is something we've seen across the country. Other people I've spoken to scoff at the thought of any kind of vision of social reform, including the one brought by radical Islamists. The revolution has disappointed them, so any kind of revolutionary ideology has less appeal. So I would say, as we say, the bloom is very much off the rose. The utopian luster of jihadism has dramatically subsided. At the same time, what we've seen is a proliferation of conspiracy thinking about IS and jihadism among many of the same youth who had expressed casual sympathy with it in 2013, even individuals. So although we might find the notion bizarre among Tunisia's youth, the most widely held belief about Islamic State is that the group is an American creation and part of a sinister conspiracy by Western powers in Israel to create further division and strife in the Muslim world. Again, this is something which we don't have to agree with, but we need to understand that it's something which people believe. In Tunisia itself, most people adopt a similar line of conspiracy thinking when it comes to terrorism, but names the state or shadowy elements of the security apparatus as the culprits who stand behind events like the Sousse attacks. So if you look at conspiracy theories as at least indicators of where the political imagination is, I think that this can tell you a lot. And the simple conclusion I've reached is that Salafism is simply not cool anymore. At least not cool in the way that it was in the immediate years after the revolution. Conspiracy theories, though they seem absurd, can tell us how people are thinking. So having mixed in these circles for a few years now, mostly among sympathizers or people who are kind of staying objective but expressing views about issues from time to time, the more interesting thing is the timing of when these conspiracy theories really started. And it was actually in the summer of 2014, after IS captured Mosul and became known for its incredible brutality against religious minorities. There was a lot of euphoria at the beginning, but then as the implications of these gains spread, people became a little bit more uneasy. And so the actionable conclusion is that IS has lost most of its appeal and is now simply a fringe ideology. And so I would say that the chances of jihadists gaining territory in Tunisia or encountering regions where jihadists can actually control the street is simply not realistic, at least not in the way we've seen in Libya or other countries. And so just to summarize, because jihadism has lost its utopian credibility, which is the third element of the cocktail, I think the phenomenon has peaked and is unlikely to increase in the near future. Terrorism could continue with sporadic strikes every few months, but I don't expect a dramatic increase in the intensity of terrorism because the ideology no longer has the broad-based pool of potential recruits it once had. Now, what about the threat of foreign fighters? Much has been made of the potential of the thousands of Tunisians who have gone to Syria or Libya and the possibility of returning to mount attacks. And the anxiety is based on the claim which is correct numerically. Despite this, however, I do not believe that the foreign fighters will dramatically reshape the security landscape in Tunisia. And so to show this, consider the three different options that foreign fighters have. First, foreign fighters could stay in Libya or Syria indefinitely. There is no reason they need to go back to Tunisia. And I think there is reasonable evidence that this is the most likely path they will take. The foreign fighters know that in most cases they will be arrested upon their return to Tunisia. The Tunisian police have sources in almost every community, and because people from Tunisian neighborhoods were talking openly amongst themselves at the time about who was going to Syria and who wasn't, I think it's likely that the Tunisian authorities have a fairly complete list of who's gone to Syria and these different communities. And also there are some important ideological reasons not to return. Jihadist groups in Syria and Iraq claim to be building a caliphate and creating a state where one can live a pure form of Islam. And returning to Tunisia would be returning to the land of tyrants and apostasy. So one ritual that some ISIS recruits needed to undergo is a symbolic burning of their passports. Therefore, I will say many of these fighters will not return. Also, one should remember that given the brutality of the war, many of the thousands of people who went to Syria have been killed. Second, foreign fighters could return to Tunisia and then seek to integrate back into their communities. This has happened a little bit. But because jihadism and Salafism has lost so much legitimacy in these communities, such returning fighters would be integrating back into families and networks of childhood friends who are not at all with them in their ideological sympathies. I've seen this happen in a few cases, and I don't underestimate its importance. Additionally, these returning jihadists are usually kept under extensive police surveillance and are having their movements constantly tracked. So it would be very difficult for them to mount attacks under these conditions. Now third, and I would say this is probably the more worrying possibility, foreign fighters could return to Tunisia for the express purpose of conducting attacks. And this is what we saw with the Bardo attacks and the Sousse attacks and various other strikes in terms of people who have been arrested in mountains. This is by far the most challenging option, however, and there are several obstacles that returning jihadists would face in doing this. First, because of the factors mentioned above, the death of jihadism as a utopian ideology, there are simply no safe havens in populated areas for jihadists of this category to operate openly. For this reason, we've seen a variety of tactics that may allow jihadists to launch sporadic terrorist attacks in the short term, but don't augur well for their ability to meaningfully destabilize the country. Some have disappeared into the mountainous region along Tunisia's border with Algeria. But given the hostility of the local populations to their presence, the heavy surveillance and bombardment of these areas, and the strong military presence, these jihadists have only succeeded in launching quick hit-and-run attacks. Some have sought to launch cross-border attacks, and as we saw with the recent strike in Ben Guerdan, which was planned and executed by jihadists who had slipped into Tunisia from Libya in the days and weeks prior to the attack. This again proves, however, that the reach of such jihadists is limited. If they had more autonomy and local support, they could have infiltrated the country far sooner. Or they could launch attacks like this in other regions that are not on the immediate border, which is relatively easy to infiltrate. But this does not seem to be within the jihadist capability. The Tunisian state generally controls this territory, and I don't think it's likely to change because they no longer have the popular sympathy, which they may have had in some regions initially. So let's talk very tangibly about... I'm getting really bad with this skipping ahead slides, but let's talk very tangibly about the threat to foreign assets in Tunisia. We've covered a lot of analytical ground here, so the following points are ways to take the analysis and try to figure out what we can immediately plan for in the future. And I say this as an American currently living in Tunisia who has a very strong desire to stay alive, so I have a skin in the game, as we say. So I think the chance of vast swaths of Tunisia becoming lawless and outside the control of the state is very remote. The hostility that so many Tunisians now have to jihadism and their belief that it is itself the product of a cynical conspiracy by Western powers means that such forces are not able to find these areas where they can plan attacks with impunity. Therefore, while it's too early to proclaim that there will be an improvement in Tunisia's security outlook, I don't predict a substantial deterioration. the on-the-ground dynamics are not there for that. To the extent to which security can affect a country's economic outlook, I don't see Tunisia completely collapsing, as some worry it might. Despite this, travel in border regions is absolutely not advised, and if there were to be any threat of kidnapping, it would most likely happen in these areas. So for those who want specifics, on the Algerian border, the governorates are Jndouba, El Kef, and Gesrin, all of which have seen hit-and-run attacks launched against security patrols operating in those regions. In general, mountainous areas should be avoided if possible, even outside of these governorates. And on the Libyan border, the governorates are Tatouine and Mednin, and especially the immediate border cities of Dehiba, Ramada, and Ben Gardan. Although the Tunisian territory is well secured, its borders are not secured, and so the chance that someone could slip in and out with a hostage is not at all out of the realm of possibility. And this is something to take very seriously. On the mountainous area, it's also possible that jihadists could slip into the mountains with someone, so that's why traveling along these roads that are not well secured and remote in the areas where jihadists are operating should be strongly discouraged. Despite the loss of jihadist credibility, I also believe that terrorism will continue in the isolated way it has so far. As far as what might be targets, because the tourist traffic has almost completely halted in Tunisia, I think it would be unlikely that tourist facilities would be attacked simply because very few foreigners would be found there. Although, if too many people take this advice, then it could become a target again. As far as symbols of Western political and economic power, I do think that these places do remain targets, and I continue to say that all foreigners living in Tunisia should remain vigilant, especially in terms of their interaction with the strangers. The complex truth about terrorism is that it can strike anywhere at any time, and given the reality of the situation in Tunisia, while the jihadist ideology has been weakened, the few supporters that do exist still remain dangerous. But I also believe that the chance of any one person being in the wrong place at the wrong time are slim as well. So recent events have shown that there is a high terrorist threat today in European cities like London, Paris, or Brussels, and many jihadist supporters here in Britain as well. So at the end of the day, it depends on what level of risk the individual is willing to live with. There are real threats in Tunisia. The country is not as dangerous, and the threats are not as severe, I believe, as the media would have one believe, but they do exist and should be taken seriously. So now, having covered Tunisia in depth, I want to close by discussing some of the other countries in North Africa and what this analysis can reveal about them. And this, again, is an application of some of the ideas I've got from my analysis of Tunisia to these other states. So let's turn first to Algeria. Algeria is interesting because it's essentially Tunisia plus. All of the dynamics that exist in Tunisia as far as jihadist resonance exist in Algeria, but more intensely. What this means is that while the risk of jihadists seriously challenging the state in Algeria is even lower because the utopian bloom is even more off the rose, I also think the chances of individual violent incidents is higher. We talked significantly about a cultural basis of jihadism as an anti-centralization ideology in Tunisia and other parts of the Arab world. Now, here the key dynamic was how memories of past battles with tyrannical authorities create this vision of masculinity and political performance. Now, this exists in Algeria, but on a much more mass scale, because it's not necessarily these isolated areas, but it's the entire country and the important legacy which the Algerian War of Independence still plays in the political discourse in the country and how even the current ruling party and the current president thinks of itself. The fact that Bouteflika was actually a participant in this uprising, I think, is still something which is significant. Since the 1980s, in sort of a parallel way to the way jihadists have used the past battles with the state in Tunisia, radical Islamists in Algeria have used rhetoric that cast their struggle to install Sharia as merely a continuation of the bloody armed struggle against the French. Secularists were labeled as the next generation of colonial oppressors. So to the extent that the memory of armed struggle against the French remains salient, there is a powerful set of cultural symbols that jihadists can continue to draw on to attract support. Despite this, however, Islamism and jihadism has been deprived of its utopian luster since the mid-1990s, after a brutal civil war between armed Islamist brigades and Algeria's security forces resulted in the deaths of what's estimated to be 200,000 Algerians. The violence in Algeria was so horrific that it appears to have made the Algerian public skeptical of any revolutionary ideology, especially one with Islamist or jihadist themes. The Arab Spring never really caught on in Algeria, despite initial protests in December 2010. Algeria and Tunisia were protesting together even before Egypt joined, but then it sort of fizzled out in Algeria. So for the same reason, there is evidence that IS has not found much popular support. The clearest evidence is the remarkably small number of Algerian foreign fighters in Syria based on available data, something quite astonishing given Algeria's large population and historical experience with jihadism. Now, despite this, the threats of the isolated groups of jihadists conducting attacks in the same way I've discussed in Tunisia exists in Algeria, and in some ways I think the risk could be greater, and that's because it's a country that has terrain which is much easier to hide in than Tunisia. The country, I've often joked, is tailor-made for armed insurgency because there are so many remote mountainous areas with heavy tree cover that help jihadist groups avoid detection by surveillance aircraft. The Herve Gordel kidnapping and killing in 2014 is an evidence that these areas can provide a type of temporary safe haven in a way that the smaller, more isolated mountainous areas in Tunisia do not. And then second, because Algeria shares an even bigger, harder control border with Libya and also with the area where jihadists have historically operated in Mali, the country faces a greater risk of jihadists being able to infiltrate from one of these safe havens to launch an attack. This is something we saw in the Islamist hostage crisis, and it's something which could be repeated. So while jihadism is not a serious political force in Algeria, the threat of terrorism is still real. Now, I want to talk about Morocco because I don't think the risk is that great, but I think it also helps us understand the phenomenon more generally when we ask why it's not as great in Morocco. So Morocco has had remarkable stability given what has historically been a much more desperate economic situation than either Tunisia or Algeria, although it's improved a lot since the revolution. It also has historically had a restive, economically deprived tribal hinterland. It has a mountainous terrain. So on a superficial level, one would think that it could conceivably be a society where jihadists could gain great advantage. Nevertheless, although it has sent some fighters to Syria, it is significantly less than Tunisia, and that's incredible given its larger population. Jihadism has never had a significant street presence in Morocco either. In fact, the most powerful banned anti-state Islamist movement known as the Justice and Charity Movement, or the Adala wa Ihsan movement, has a distinctly Sufi interpretation of the religion that IS would find sacrilegious, and it advocates preaching and social activism over violent jihad. So the question is, why has Morocco produced comparatively fewer extremists than Tunisia, and is this sustainable? I think the answer to both questions can be found in how the state has approached the question of religion and tradition. Recall how we said jihadism resonates because it represents the diametrical opposite of the state. In Tunisia, it's the most taboo ideology. Morocco is distinct from Tunisia in that after colonialism, the Moroccan state did not pursue a modernization program that tried to make Morocco exactly like the West. As a monarchy with a religious basis for its legitimacy, the regime tried to make religion of its particular interpretation a key part of Moroccan identity and strengthen religious institutions. Sufi brotherhoods enjoy substantial social influence. So this has created two dynamics in my view. First, the state and the monarchy has much more legitimacy among the population. The king is seen as a respected symbol of the people, in contrast to Tunisia's squabbling political parties and deep security state, both of which are seen as despotic. Second, for those youth who are alienated from the state and seek to totally rebel against the system, jihadism as an ideology that also has religious overtones simply wouldn't be the most logical choice as an extremely subversive ideology. Religious symbols of protest are simply not as strongly resonant in Morocco as they would be in Tunisia. It's a much more conservative society. So this, I argue, gives Morocco a more positive long-term outlook in terms of security, and also helps reflect back on some of the other cases we've studied and why they may be facing the problems which they do. So Egypt is a very difficult case to understand. The social problems it faces are far greater than Tunisia's. Anybody who's been to both Cairo and Tunis can note the difference immediately. It's also a country that has historically contributed to the development of the international jihadist movement. Many of the ideological theorists of modern Islamic radicalism, like Sayyid Qutb, are Egyptian and have roots in an earlier iteration of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Qaeda merged with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad organization in 1998, and this was one of the key moves that catapulted bin Laden onto the world stage. When one looks at the limited data we have, Egypt does not seem to be a significant contributor of foreign fighters to IS compared to Tunisia, despite its absolutely massive population. It is also a country that is relatively difficult to find safe haven in. One could disappear into some remote neighborhood in Cairo, but most of the population is funneled along the narrow banks of the Nile. So there are just not mountainous areas to find safe haven in. The one exception to this is the Sinai Peninsula, which, not surprisingly, has seen an armed Islamist uprising take off. Despite these dynamics, I do not discount that radical Islamism could find more broad-based legitimacy in Egypt in the near future, and I'm more pessimistic about Egypt than even Algeria. As Sisi consolidates his authoritarian stranglehold over the society and the utopian luster of Sisi's perverse nationalism wears off, people may begin to consciously look for an alternative. Because Sisi has cast himself as distinctly anti-Islamist, those seeking to repudiate Sisi could well adopt an Islamist or jihadist identity if opposition to his rule ever reaches a tipping point. The Muslim Brotherhood's initial victory in Egypt's elections showed that there is at least some latent sympathy for the Islamist vision, and the overthrow of Morsi by the military might prove to many to be a confirmation of the jihadist argument that the only way for social reform is violent jihad and participation in elections is a fool's errand. If jihadism requires people to view it as a utopian ideology, the coup actually, I think, helped preserve the idea of Islamism and the Sharia as a utopian vision. So this, along with the Egyptian public's unpredictability and tendency to oscillate dramatically between different political visions, should give those seeking to do business in Egypt cause for concern. And finally, Libya, which I'm sure a lot of people are interested in. Libya is an interesting case. My work deals primarily with jihadist recruitment in countries that still have some semblance of state control rather than anarchic war zones. But I still believe that my research in Tunisia has lessons that help us understand Libya. So in Libya, an IS affiliate has a strong presence in the east of the country around the cities of Benghazi and Derna, and controls large swaths of territory around the central city of Sirte, as well as the city itself. They also have a more limited presence in many other areas of Libya. So earlier I stated that, in my view, jihadism found such strong support in Libya because of its nomadic Bedouin legacy, and later Gaddafi's policies of cultivating this illusion of statelessness among the population. This made people less invested in the idea of a state with Western trappings, and also primed them for the language of honor and resistance to centralization that jihadism speaks in. But I believe that the loss of jihadism's credibility as a utopian ideology, the same dynamic that I've discussed in other contexts, applies here as well. While eastern Libya still has other jihadist brigades with tremendous influence, IS was notably driven out of its stronghold of Derna in June of 2015. And while these militias also had a jihadist character, they were in alliance with the Tripoli government and shows they may be motivated more by nationalist rather than transnationalist concerns, despite being deeply Islamists. I say this as an outside observer, however, rather than as a field researcher on the ground in Libya itself. Now, what we should look to is one of the newer dynamics, really just over the past 2 years, is that the place that IS has gained control over territory in Libya is Sirte, which is Gaddafi's former hometown. It was the last place to fall to the rebels in 2011, and it's a region that's populated by members of Gaddafi's tribe, an area where, by all accounts, the former regime enjoyed great support even as the revolution was taking off. So it's not so hard to imagine why jihadism flourished here. Those least invested in the revolution and least likely to view the militia-led struggle for a new political order in Libya as legitimate are the ones most primed to seek an alternative. In the sense that jihadism serves as a rejectionist ideology of everything but itself, it's not surprising it took hold in Sirte. As an active war zone, Libya is going to be far more dangerous and difficult to predict than any other countries in the region. But if forced to make a prediction, I would say that while IS will probably not be dislodged from Sirte anytime soon, the chances of it coming to rule other parts of Libya are low, given that they don't have the same level of alienation from the current political order. So we're nearly done. Just as some closing thoughts, what we've seen today is an analysis on the street level of micromechanisms for understanding a phenomena which we all care about in many other contexts. And I think that the true value of this research is that when we look at it, we can start to ask new and different questions about jihadism in other contexts, which we would not have asked had we not been able to observe it in its natural habitat. And so the idea of this kind of research being transferable is an approach which I'm strongly invested in, and I think it's one of the values of, it's the value of what we're trying to do here at Minas Associates as well. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.